Hello, welcome to everybody. My name is Noelle Norton. I am the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of San Diego, of course. So welcome to USD Conversations. This is our weekly speaker series throughout this pandemic, where we feature faculty, alumni, and friends who share their insight about current events and timely themes. So this summer series is hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences and USD Humanities Center and the Office of Alumni. Following our very popular spring semester series, we were urged to host a couple more events over the summer, thanks to an unexpected outpouring, prompting and support from our alumni, asking how educated students can continue to support Black friends, family, and colleagues. We heard your voices, all of you former students, and we are delighted to bring you today's USD Conversations event, the second in our summer series. So today's topic is, as you know, what is defunding the police? And we have two guest speakers. One is Dr. Cid Martinez from USD, and one of our community partners, Khaled Alexander, and they will, I'm going to give you an introduction about both of them in a minute. They will provide a history of community activism and policing policies, background information on police reform, and the current defund movement and how it relates to the abolition movement. Okay, so Dr. Cid Martinez is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, where he teaches courses in juvenile delinquency, deviance, social theory, and urban sociology. His current research is an ethnographic study that examines the relationship between urban poverty, policing, and gun violence in California. Just 2 weeks ago, we're really proud of Dr. Martinez. His 2016 book, The Neighborhood Has Its Own Rules, was recommended in a lengthy New York Times article titled, How We Got Here, Writers on Race and Racism in America, which called out his book as an astute analysis of activist politics in Los Angeles. His newest book, another one, it's a book manuscript, is tentatively titled Cops and Clergy, Legitimacy, Trust, and Violence Reduction. And this book builds on previous research by exploring how perceived legitimacy of local clergy can be leveraged by law enforcement to reduce violence. We are also extremely happy to have Khaled Alexander with us for today's conversation. Khaled is a full-time English professor at San Diego City College, where he also spearheaded the annual Social Justice and Education Conference. He is the president and founder of Pillars of the Community, a nonprofit organization that works with those targeted by law enforcement for meaningful systematic reform. So I want to thank both of you for being here, and thanks to everyone in our audience. It's quite a large audience today. We are so happy you are joining us. USD is especially proud to be able to bring scholarly perspectives on controversial topics in this forum. We know these topics are challenging, but because we're a university, that's what we tackle them head on, and we invite our community partners, alumni, staff, and faculty to engage in these conversations with us as we learn together. So, as I think you know, we will be taking your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll save the last 15 or 20 minutes for a Q&A session. Some of you submitted some questions earlier, and I have those here. I'll look at them. And do know, I think it's in the chat room, that you are going to be, your video will be off during the presentation, but we'll turn it back on once the Q&A begins. So I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for coming out today. I want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences and Dean Norton and Alumni Relations as well. What I thought we would do today is begin the discussion by showing a trailer of my documentary, which looks at policing, and it looks at the activist response to policing. It addresses many of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. So I thought we'd kick it off with a trailer from my documentary to get the discussion going. So I'll turn it back to you all for the video now.
Law enforcement and enforcing the law is really just a small piece of the pie when it comes to overall community health. And so that we also have to understand. People of color are overrepresented across our judicial system, our prison system. It's a cycle. These are historical issues going back to, you know, the slave era and all that. And you look at this, and unfortunately, some of these people of color, through no fault of their own, are ignorant to this cycle. I would say per capita, there are less job training, less counseling, less services for people of color in these poor, low-income communities. Yet, where do parolees get released to, right? When they get out of prison, they have to go back to where they committed the offense. And so here we go. This cycle continues.
Community outrage still surrounding this police video showing them pursuing a man suspected of breaking into cars and smashing the window of a house. Officers believed that Stephon Clark had a gun, but after shooting him, realized he didn't.
I hope that we can just show love to each other and just come together like this for no reason. It shouldn't take a death for us to just show love to each other. That's why it continues now. Because we all by ourselves until somebody dies.
The amount of shots and the fact the media will not say that this is not black versus white, this is right versus wrong. One of the officers were black, and we are still standing out here together.
Stephon Clark. You're Stephon Clark. Stephon Clark. Today at the press conference, we made sure his family wanted us to say his name, never forget his name. Now, of course, we didn't want to have to remember that young man's name this way, but we're going to say his name over and over and over again. Stephon Clark, Stephon Clark, Stephon Clark.
There's no training that can prepare you to come into our communities, use our communities. There's not a training. The only training that it is experience and living here and going through.
Okay. I apologize for the sound and the video quality. It's kind of hard to get these things going over Zoom. But I think the video is important because it really addresses some important issues about policing, about the role of policing in communities, the lack of services. And that's fundamentally what Defund the Police is about. It's about community activists, about community members trying to play more of a role in shaping policing in the community. So today, I don't have my PowerPoint up, so I guess I'm gonna go old school, which is what I'm used to doing in the classroom, so we'll do it here today. I'm gonna talk about three things today. I'm gonna talk about the history of policing in America. I'm gonna talk about the abolition movement, specifically police abolition, and I'm gonna use those two things to get at what we're calling defund the police. And I've heard a lot of people in the media talk about the origins of policing. And what you hear a lot of is that policing in America has its roots, especially when it comes to Black folks, rooted in slave patrols. And that's right. That's absolutely right. So I want to contribute to that narrative, but I want to provide some more nuanced ideas relative to policing in America and what it's looked like for Black and brown folks. So the origins of policing can be traced back to a system of what's known as the watchman system. And it takes two varieties. In the North, the watchman system was meant to sort of watch what was going on, but it was accountable to the courts, and it mostly was designed to deal with, in a kind of reactive way, with regulating crime, but in a very kind of reactive way. In the South, it takes a very different form, and the watchman system is tied to the slave patrols. And as many people know, you don't get a system like slavery in place without violence. Violence was fundamental to the institutionalization of slavery, and the slave patrols played an important role in terrorizing, in surveilling, and in enforcing the law. So that's the background. But today, what I want to emphasize, I want to go a little deeper, and I want to talk about the kind of policing that we get in New York. New York becomes the model for the country, and it's the first instance of organized policing in America. And I think what's important to note is that in New York, New York was undergoing lots of urbanization. It was undergoing industrialization in the early 20th century, and a lot of problems emerge in New York as a result of this system. So as a result, to deal with vagrancy, to deal with homelessness, to deal with the after effects of industrial advanced capitalism, New York implements or borrows this model from London. It's called the London model of policing. And that model, just so you know the origins of the London model, that model is based on a system that was used to colonize Ireland. The English couldn't break the Irish, so they developed this military system. They called it the police, and the big difference would be that this model of policing would create rule and order and peace, so it wasn't a military function. So some distinct things to note about this type of policing that's different from the watchman system. Number one, it has an organized military bureaucracy. Number two, and this is a very important point, it's accountable to city government, not the courts like we see in the watchman system. And number three, it proactively sought to deter crime. Now, why is that important? It's important because this becomes the model for the rest of the country, but it's also important to note that because of this model of policing, we end up in America with 128,000 different types of policing units in America, and they're all accountable to different city governments, and there's no standardized use of force. And this is a direct result of the New York model. I think that's important to note. We fast forward to the rest of the country as it starts to become urbanized, and you get three distinct types of policing that emerge from the New York model. In New York, the model is to protect business interests, to protect capitalists, because now you have all these poor people roaming the streets, disrupting the system. So fundamentally, policing was designed to protect property. Number two, it was intended to create order amongst the working class, to deal with their issues, to deal with what Eric Monconen, the historian, refers to as the dangerous class. So two functions: protect property and to deal with the dangerous class, which is really the working class. That's model number one. This is the model that sort of starts it all off. In the South, we get a model of policing that is directly wed to the slave patrols that I talked about earlier in the watchman system. There in the South, you get a form of policing that has an informal mob, extra legal component with a highly bureaucratized model. And so it's a little different, right? So its focus is on dealing with issues of racism and maintaining what happens after the Civil War during Reconstruction. And then in the Southwest, you get a model kind of similar to the South. It's this bureaucratized military structure, but it's meant to deal with, don't forget that California was annexed through colonization about 30 years earlier. That was always a threat. Dealing with Native Americans was a threat, and dealing with fugitive slaves earlier was an issue, but this is after the Civil War, so that wasn't so much the issue anymore. So you get three different types of policing, not just one, but they all have three things things in common that I really want to emphasize. Number one, they all have wide discretion of use of force. Number two, they're all about protecting private property. That was the primary mission. And number three, and this is the most important point, that all of these units, what they all have in common is they're designed to keep the racial order in place. Police were fundamental to maintaining race relations during Reconstruction, during Jim Crow, and I would even argue now in the colorblind racist society that we live in maintaining race relations. So really, when we look at policing, what we're looking at isn't just the police, but the racism and the capitalist structure, which I would argue are connected to one another. And the police were originally designed to keep that structure in place. And this is fundamentally the cause of, I think, of where we're at now. So we have to ask ourselves, is this the structure that we want to continue to have going forward? And the answer is no. I think this is what a lot of the protests in America are all about. Okay, that's point number one. Number two, I want to talk about police abolition. What is police abolition? I think if we're talking about abolition or police abolition, we need to go back to slavery. And police abolition, as some scholars would argue, is just a moment in the horizon of abolition going back to slavery. That's essentially what we're looking at. And these were, abolition was an attempt to promote dignity and freedom, and it was also an attempt to emancipate society from oppressive forces in society. So that's we talk about police abolition. This is just another moment in abolition, if we think about it on a continuum. Then there's prison abolition, and I think prison abolition. Here we go. We got the slide going. Great. Is an important moment to think about because it also lays the foundation for police abolition. And there are a couple of people that I want to mention, here we go, that were instrumental in laying the foundation for prison abolition. Let's start with George Jackson. George Jackson was a Black Panther. He wrote a book called Soledad Brother. And in that book, Jackson outlined the oppressive nature of prisons. He said that prisons were used as an instrument of disciplining Black folks outside the prison, and they punished people through prison guards on the inside. So Jackson's book was very instrumental in informing the left in the 1960s. And just to back up for a second, the 1960s in California is kind of the moment when prison abolition really takes off in America, and it's in the Bay Area in Oakland where a lot of the ideas of prison abolition emerge. The next person I would say that was instrumental was Angela Davis. She's a philosopher, a critical theorist, and so already back in the 60s, she was talking about prison abolition as another moment, as a kind of stream of consciousness that we could connect back to abolition and slavery. And then there's Thomas Matheson. He was a Norwegian criminologist, and Matheson was looking at prison abolition in Norway. And basically, Matheson thought that a lot of things that were being criminalized in Norway, maybe they could be better dealt with through a social welfare system. So he made a lot of progress in decriminalizing vagrancy and public drunkenness, instead try to find a harm reduction way of dealing with those issues. So prison abolition, very important if we're talking about police abolition. And that's the next thing I want to talk about, police abolition. That gets us a little bit closer to the defund the police moment. And again, I think if we're going to talk about abolition, we have to look at the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were the first organized resistance to that London model that I referred to earlier. That model that emerges in New York, the London model, is what the Black Panthers were resisting, not just ideologically, but in terms of practice. And so it was kind of the first attempt to resist policing. It was an attempt at trying to confront police officers for their violence in the community, to raise awareness. and to build community as well. Angela Davis, also important. Her work was important in not only laying the foundation for prison abolition, but also noting the oppressive nature of policing as well. And now we're getting closer to the defund the police moment, and finally we get to the importance of Black Lives Matter. And I think Black Lives Matter, it needs to be noted that Black women were at the forefront of organizing this movement. And I think what Black Lives Matter was really trying to do, and you kind of capture the sentiment of Black Lives Matter through the work of Patrisse Cullors. She's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. And fundamentally, police abolition for Cullors and other foundational members of BLM is about reclaiming public safety. One of the reasons why police abolition never rises to the forefront of resistance is because nobody really questioned what public safety and the utility of public safety. And now, beginning with Michael Brown in 2013, actually I would say going back to 1992, Oscar Grant, all these were antecedent movements that led to the development of Black Lives Matters. And really it's an attempt to reclaim public safety. It provides a framework for thinking about community response to social ills instead of police responding to social ills. One other person that I want to mention on the next slide, if we could transition to the Defund the Police slide, comes from the work of Mariam Kaba. Mariam Kaba is an organizer in Chicago. And Mariam Kaba, I think, gives us three things to think about when we're thinking about the police abolition movement. And number one is the complete dismantling of prisons, policing, and surveillance. That's number one. Number two, rethinking the ways in which we relate to one another. And number three, and I think this is an important idea that Defund the Police draws from this idea, the importance of investing in the development of communities. Those are sort of three central ideas that I would say we get from the police abolition movement. Now I want to be clear about something, because there's a lot of activists and a lot of scholars who will say that's what police abolition is about. What we see in the Defund the Police movement is something a little bit different. And one of the important points I want to stress here today to get clarity about this issue is that for many people pushing for the Defund the Police movement, they are reformist. They're not trying to get rid of the police. They're trying to change policing. They're not trying to zero out policing budgets. And I know there's a lot of fear. I hear a lot of people say, what are we going to do without the police? For many people pushing for Defund the Police, it's not about zeroing out the budget. So we have two different ideological views when we talk about Defund the Police. And I think it's important to differentiate the abolitionists versus the reformists. They're not quite the same, but they have overlapping interests when it comes to defund the police. So when we talk about defunding the police, what we're talking about is diverting funding from the police back to the community via social services. And on this slide here, you'll note that LAPD, this recently happened a couple weeks ago, has now decided to allocate $150 million from their $3 billion police budget back to the community. A lot of people would say that's pocket change if you think about the overall budget that LAPD has. New York has decided to reallocate $1 billion from its $6 billion budget to the community. Again, a lot of people think it's mostly symbolic. It's not really serious change, but these are important first steps. So when we talk about reallocating money, think about this. And again, I think this is why it's important to go back to that London model of policing rooted in city government, right? This is where the budgets come from. If you look at most cities, about 40%, I would say at least 40% on average of city budgets are allocated to policing and corrections. And in some cities, it's even more. So when we talk about defunding the police, we're talking about reinvesting in the community, taking money from the police, reinvesting in counseling, job training, mental health services, drug rehabilitation. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. It's a gradual movement. It's not going to happen overnight. A lot of people still don't know what it's going to look like. I know we're running out of time, so I'm gonna wrap up here to try to leave time for Khalid. But let me just leave you all what I think is really important. This is why I'm so glad that Khalid is here today. This is a moment where we see Blacks, Latinos, whites sort of coming together. But I think what's important to note is to learn or to think about what happened in the past. And in 1968, after the 1968 Democratic Convention, what we saw was a kind of a change, that the pendulum shifted and business went back to normal once Nixon became president. So I think three things have to happen. Number one, people need to listen. This goes for academics and policymakers. People need to listen to community residents and activists. They have to be willing to share power with Black folks and brown folks. And number three, they have to be willing to share power. I think to really seize on this moment, those are the things that we have to consider going forward. And that's it. That's my shtick on the history of policing, police abolition, and its connection to defund the police. So I'm going to turn it over to Khalid now. By the way, let me introduce Khalid. Let me just say a couple things. Sorry. Khalid is a community builder. He's been working, he works at Pillars of the Community, and he's been doing this for many years. I know a lot of people are paying attention to this, but a couple of years ago, these are the kinds of things that not everyone always appreciates. So he's been in the grind doing this work before most people noticed it, and he's also a professor of English literature at San Diego City College too. So I think it's important to know his contribution to the community. Okay, Khalid, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this conversation in the first place. And as you kind of alluded to, the ideas around defunding the police and police abolition certainly can't be wrapped up in an hour presentation. But I think this is an important first step to have, organizations of higher education like USD giving a platform for these discussions. Also, I'd be remiss not to give a shout out to a dear friend and mentor of mine who I see in the attendees, Bishop Bowser, who is another person who has been on the front lines of police abolition and police and the fight to defund the police, even before those were names associated with the struggle. We live in historic times. And watching the spark of George Floyd's horrendous and brutal murder and the ensuing protests that happened around the country, I think marked the beginning of these historic times. And I think it's important to recognize that the reason why the media has begun to focus it, the reason why we're beginning to have conversations like these in settings that are less than typical is not only because of the murder of George Floyd or of Breonna Taylor, but because the collective outrage and the collective pain felt by Black and brown communities like Southeast San Diego and similar communities around the United States. But one of the things that's been most interesting in kind of watching these uprisings and watching the times that we see unfolding in front of us has been the shock at the way that peaceful protesters in the streets have been abused by law enforcement. And when I say abused, I mean pepper sprayed, I mean beaten with batons, women who are molested by officers who are tackling them and throwing them into police vehicles. And us recognizing that they don't deserve that. Us recognizing that these people who are out there in the streets non-violently protesting don't deserve to be treated that way. And the shock at how these people are treated is valid. My personal shock is not necessarily the way that the police are acting, but more over who is being victimized by those actions in these cases. So people who are not used to seeing the face of brutality of police and the experience of what it's like to be on the other side of policing when you're viewed as the other, when you're viewed as the bad guy, are now the ones who are having to live with the consequences of a militarized police department that views issues not as much in a racial black and white, but in a philosophical black and white of right and wrong, where there's a power imbalance. That those people who are being looked at as the other, those people who are looked at as the bad guys, they have no rights, they have no abilities. And as you mentioned, as a literature major, specifically comparative literature, one of the things that attracted me to literature was the ability to see things from other people's perspective, was the ability to recognize the humanity in somebody that I may not have grown up with, I might not have a shared experience with, but I'm able to recognize their humanity. A good example of that, of literature like that, that most people have read would be Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, where you have a main character who is flawed in a number of different ways, but that the reader, if the reader approaches the literature with a mind willing to accept the humanity of the other, can then see that although we may not agree with many of the character traits, we still recognize the humanity, we still recognize the pain, and we can at least understand where that person is coming from. And so it's important for us to recognize that in the United States, we have created an other. And we haven't, and it's taken us a long time to recognize that in the same way that colonialism, imperialism created the other in the savage in Africa, or has created the other in the savage in the Americas or the United States, in that same way, we have created others in our own communities. And so I say that we're in a historical moment, not because of new conversations that are being had. These conversations are not historic at all. These conversations are conversations that the community has been having with police and that the community has been having with elected officials. The difference is it's the people who, none of these conversations are new. They're only new to people who haven't been the direct recipients of this type of violence. It's only new to people who haven't been direct recipients of this kind of daily degradation that is handed out to community members in Southeast San Diego every day. A good example of this is any kind of conversations. I've been having these conversations, as Bishop Bowser and others have been having, with law enforcement for years. We started Pillars of the Community in 2010 and immediately began talking with police chief. At that time, it was a different police chief, Lansdowne, I believe, and talking to them about the pain and talking to them about racial profiling and talking to them about how we're treated by police, only to be dismissed as these are perceptions. So our lived experiences, the realities of our lives growing up in these communities, the reality of our lives living in these communities have always been dismissed as perceptions or a cultural misunderstanding. A perfect example of this, I think, is the gang suppression unit, right? So we can look at the entire police department, but the gang suppression unit and the way that people who have been documented and called gang members are treated, I think, is particularly important. Because if somebody's labeled as a gang member, if somebody can be viewed as a gang member, they no longer have the same constitutional rights as anybody else. They no longer literally have the right to breathe, the right to live, the right to be treated with dignity. And the gang suppression unit, which is, I think they rebranded themselves as like the gang special operations unit or something like that. But it's essentially a police unit that gets close to $9 million to operate outside of the typical jurisdiction of other police departments and other policing districts. that literally drive around like the wild, wild west and pull people over. And the first question that they ask people is, are you a documented gang member? Are you a fourth waiver, meaning have you waived your Fourth Amendment rights because of prior felonies? And lastly, do you have any tattoos? And at first, when I moved to Southeast San Diego, I was pulled over 3 times within a period of 2 weeks. And it was the first time that I had been asked that question, are you a gang member? And at first I thought it was in order to identify who I am, but quickly realized over the years that it's really not a question of who you are, but it's a question of how many of your rights can I get away with violating? And if somebody has been labeled as a gang member, that person is now, can be detained. We can say that we feared for our life because of that person's apparent gang membership. And how somebody can be labeled as a gang member is as arbitrary as any form of colonialism or imperialism that we've ever seen. I bring all of these things up. So for example, if you're wearing a gang color, for example, blue, in a gang neighborhood, you can read any black and brown neighborhood in San Diego, and you happen to be seen talking to a gang member, that's enough to document you as a gang member. The consequences of which are huge. If teenagers are pulled over who are perceived as gang members and searched and have their private parts, literally 12-year-old kids, 10-year-old kids who have their private parts molested and fondled by police officers in some type of power play and in some type of an attempt to control and exert themselves and intimidate, then it should be no kind of controversial topic when it comes up in other circles of whether or not we should defund the police. Because the police in our communities is a very different experience than the police that most people in the United States have grown up under. I give the example of the GSU unit and the example of how so-called gang members are treated without committing any crimes as an example of that kind of othering. And I think it's important that we recognize that we've created this other, and unless we begin to listen to these stories, unless we begin to listen to the people who are most impacted by policing, we're going to continue to follow into this narrative that we have good police, the good guys who are there to protect and serve, and then you have bad guys. And you know, I was asked by a reporter a couple of weeks ago, why do I think more Black people had been ticketed for COVID, not following COVID guidelines than others? And I think that question can be asked when it comes to any type of relationship with Black people in law enforcement, whether it's incarceration, whether it's being pulled over by the police, whether it's being ticketed, whether it's being shot and murdered and killed. There's 2 answers. One is racism. And that's a long drawn out process that we're going to need to address in order to get rid of the racism that we have all grown up with. But the other point is because they can get away with it. And I think really at its heart, the defund movement and the abolition movement, and in many ways, the defund movement is reform on the way towards abolition. That it's how can we begin to take away from this ultimate power that police have over us. At what point, for example, of molestation, can a teenage boy fight back against a police officer? At what point in being beaten by a police officer can you then begin to resist? And the answer is there is none, because they have absolute power. And so community members who have become tired of having conversations with the police chief and being dismissed by the police chief, community members who are tired of having these conversations are beginning to ask, well, where do police get this power from? And the easiest answer is they get it from the funds that they receive from our elected officials. And so beginning to fight on a citywide level, beginning to fight on a level of going to those people who are supposedly supposed to be kept in check by our elected officials, that is the only way that our voices can begin to be heard. And so that conversation about taking money away from the police and investing that money into the communities, taking money from crime response and investing it in crime prevention, and investing it in organizations and neighborhoods and people who deserve to be recognized as humans is extremely important. And so I mentioned, you know, before, there's all types of emotions that go along with this historical moment that we're living in. And I think really sorrow and hope are the two kind of emotions that come to mind. You know, I'm sorry that it has taken so long for people to be interested in our pain. I'm sorry that it took seeing people who look like you, who come from your similar backgrounds as mainstream America, being abused by police in order for people to be able to recognize themselves as the other, to be able to recognize themselves through the experiences of people's everyday lives growing up in Southeast San Diego or other communities. But I am also hopeful. I'm hopeful that we're finally in a place where our voices can be listened to, a place where our reality isn't just dismissed as a perception or a misunderstanding, in a place where we can finally be recognized as human. And I really hope that this conversation is a step in the right direction. And you know, I applaud USD for holding this venue, and I also encourage you all to have, you know, more sessions like this with community members represented, so that voice of the other, so that voice that we may not hear or may not even recognize exist, can be a part of the conversations that are necessary for us all to work together to move forward. So yeah, thank you again, and let's stay hopeful.
Okay, hello, it's Noelle back again, and I think that those who are controlling all the screens are going to turn on your videos as we start to ask questions. I've got quite a few interesting questions, but first, thank you both to Cid and Khaled for a really interesting talk. I learned a lot myself, even though I used to teach urban politics. So here's one. I've got broad questions and specific. I just feel like asking this specific one. It's from Matt, and he said it's for Cid, but I think either of you can answer. Where do gun control laws fit into this analysis or this movement? Has gun control played a role similar to that of policing in maintaining economic and racial hierarchy? Do those who support police abolition also support, as Black Panthers did, the ability for individuals to protect themselves and their communities through gun ownership? That's a tough question.
It is a tough one. So I just want to make sure I'm clear about the question. So Matt is asking if gun control or the right to have guns goes with police abolition.
It looks like gun control laws. How do those fit into police abolition?
Yeah. Well,
yep,
I mean,
that's that.
Yeah, I'm you know, the thing about because I do study gun violence, that's one of my focuses in the middle of all this, and that's one thing I think that I think communities, Black and Latino communities, have kind of a different view that's often overlooked, because you get two sort of extremes. You get the liberal view, which is just, you know, let's just limit and regulate guns. Then you have the conservative view, which is everybody should have a right to have a gun, maybe except if you're Black. And then you kind of have this view in the middle where you have communities, Black and Latino communities, that are not only over-policed, but they're underprotected. So there are lots of people that I know that are Latino and Black, and they feel like they need to have guns. There are many people that feel like they can't count on the police, and so they don't want their guns taken away. And I don't think people have quite fleshed out that relationship. And then there are other people who recognize in Black and Latino communities that maybe we do need to have some gun control, because our communities tend to be, those tend to be places where gun violence is concentrated. So I think thinking about trying to tease out the Black and Latino community and their views on guns is complex, because I can also think of pictures, and Khaled can probably speak to this better. You know, if you see those pictures in the 1960s of the Black Panthers, they're armed, and they're at the they're in Sacramento at the state capitol. It's a famous picture, right? So I think it's a little, it's nuanced and it's complicated. So I think that's something that we kind of need to clarify by talking to community members more. Khaled, do you have a
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would say is that the defund movement and the abolition movement aren't generic movement. I mean, so you have views from every possible angle, whether it's, you know, complete abolition, or complete disarmament of all guns. I mean, personally, if I had the choice and it was possible, I would say, let's get rid of guns, period. And we should start with the police. There's no reason why the police should be walking around like militarized force. But I mean, the easiest question is everybody, there's many different views when it comes to it, and I think it's representative of the larger kind of US population.
Thank you. I've got another one. And actually, I had an earlier request. Cid, could you put up your first slide that has some statistics on there? There are some people that are asking about just general statistics, and I know you had on that one, if you can. In the meantime, I think this one, we might start with Khaled. What are current police leaders' responses to your positions? And this is from Sean.
The response, I mean, it's a PR campaign, essentially. I mean, they always, the response of police leadership, quote unquote leadership nowadays, is the same response as it was when we first having conversation with Lansdowne. And they say, we think that the perception of racial profiling and police abuse is problematic. But up until now, there's no police official that has come out and recognized that racial profiling even exists. So frankly, we don't have conversations with the police, because if we don't have a basis to begin that conversation, it's just kind of a political theater to show, hey, look, I'm shaking Black and brown people's hands and I'm taking pictures with them without any actual change. So even the very bottom of beginning of discourse is admitting that that a harm has taken place, and that there's an intention to address that harm. They can't even admit that harm takes place. This is as recently as on Monday, I believe, I was on a program on KPBS hosted by NCRC, where the police union representative, Scott Shafer or Jack Shafer or something like that, when he was asked whether or not he was willing to apologize about the way that police mistreat people in the streets, whether it's protesters, whether it's Black people or Mexicans, he said, I'm not really sure I can apologize. Like, it's a much more complex thing. The only reason why it's complex is because if you take racism out of the equation, all of a sudden you get an algebra or trigonometry, or clearly I was a lit major and not a math major, but all of a sudden it becomes complicated. But if you allow racism to be a part of that equation, it's a 1 + 1, it's a 1 + 1 answer.
Okay. Here is a submitted question. One that came earlier before they even heard you. This is from Maria, and she says, do you believe it's a mistake to actually use the label defund the police? Do you think that this leads to polarization?
Yeah, you know what? I've been asked that question, and frankly, like I even though I've always been fighting to defund the police, like I've never used that terminology, and so I've been asked that question a number of times, and frankly, it's semantics. If we care more about the words that people are using to describe what we're talking about than we do about the actual lives that are being taken, about the daily harassment, about the daily abuse of police, then I think that kind of shows this idea of the other, right? Like, so, hey, you know what, guys, like, let's use, this isn't meant to dismiss the question because I think it's a very important question, but hey, you guys, let's just use kinder language and maybe we'd be able to do it. We've been using language without defund the police or abolition for hundreds of years, right? That language isn't working. And so one of the things, I don't care whether we say defund or whether we say, let's take money from one area and reinvest it someplace else. Like, I'm not big on the semantics of it, but the thing that I do know is, had people not made that decision to start using the word defund, I don't think we would be having this conversation right now. I don't think that mainstream news media would be discussing it. I don't think it would be a part of conversations, and I don't even think that question would be asked. And so again, I think it's a question of semantics. And us as individuals should approach it however you feel more comfortable about. But that's my feelings about the use of the word.
Cid, did you have anything to
Yeah,
add?
I mean, I think I agree with Khaled. There's lots of different movements that were around before the defund the police movement, the way we're hearing about it, existed, and they all had different catchphrases and different titles. And so I think defund just became a kind of convenient term to describe reallocating money. And, so I think it's a little misleading because, as I mentioned in the talk, right, that for abolitionists and even more for reform folks, it's not about zeroing out the budgets. It's about reallocating budgets for policing. So there's lots of movements that are around, and I think the media and some policymakers have sort of just latched onto that term for the sake of convenience. But it is very problematic. I mean, it's alarming for some people when they hear that term defund, because it makes it look like we're just abolishing the police altogether in this moment, and that's not what's happening right now.
Although I would say that that an argument can be made that an immediate disbanding of demilitarization of police is a valid way to move forward. Dismantle them completely and build them up from scratch. Because the argument is that, if when we say that, one apple, it's only a few bad apples, but we looked at it in the context of the full sentence, spoils the bunch. And then we have police unions and police chiefs and politicians who fight to keep those bad apples in the bunch. So we would be remiss not to think about throwing the entire bunch out and looking for a new tree. And so I think it's important that we embrace being imaginative to actually think of other things. We didn't have any problem disbanding the entire military and police in Iraq when we invaded it. There's communities in Mexico City who have completely disbanded the police, kicked the police out of their neighborhoods, kicked the narcos out of their communities, and now run their own thing. So I think we have to be willing to think about all things and have real serious conversations on how to address these issues.
Okay, I have, we've got a few more minutes, so maybe a couple more questions. This is a submitted question. Do you think that there may be a backlash like the one that happened after 1968 that led to the election of Nixon following the protest and civil unrest at the Democratic Convention?
Well, I think we're living in the backlash right now. We're living in the backlash of a black president, and everybody who was offended by that, and this kind of open, unhinged racism that we see all the way at the top with Donald Trump, and that we see in the streets right now. And so if we don't push back against that backlash, we're just going to continue to be abused and taken advantage of. And so it's hard to say that when you defend yourself, that you should be careful about a backlash. And so the only alternative is not defend ourselves. And I think that's no longer an option for our communities.
Sid, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this. This question came up in my courses I taught this summer. And I think we're at a different time. I don't think Black Lives Matters is going away. The New York Times published a piece a couple weeks ago and said that the protests that we saw across America were probably the largest turnout maybe ever in American history across the country. I think that a lot of the ethnic studies classes that white students have taken and sociology courses and other courses have kind of given them this kind of awareness that didn't exist before. And so I think for the first time, we're starting to see what looks like a multiracial movement that we didn't have in the 60s. So I'm optimistic. I think it's yet to be seen, but I don't see this as a backlash. I see this kind of actually building and getting stronger. And times were very different in the 1960s. We didn't have the kind of awareness. We didn't have the kind of mass mobilization of people. And I also think there's something to be said about the economic times that we're in right now too. I think Donald Trump has sort of, his response to COVID-19 and the inequality that we're seeing has opened the eyes to a lot of people about how our state and government has failed us as well. So I think this movement's here to stay, and I'm optimistic that it's not going to be like 68. It's going to continue to grow.
There is a question. I'll ask two more unless they cut me off. There is a question from Esther, and I'm not going to ask it exactly the way that she did, but I think what she's asking is, as we would go through an abolition movement and build and create a new entity, a new structure, what happens in between? What's the timing like for something, this kind of change? I
mean, the first thing that I'll say is I really think that the idea of completely disbanding the police and starting from scratch is not a ridiculous notion. I also don't think that that's going to happen. And so in the meantime, as we work towards creating, you know, peaceful communities where we don't have to have militarized police, I think the key is we have to build community. We don't even know who our neighbors are. So the reason why cities like Chiran in Mexico are able to police themselves and have true community policing and not a militarized police force in there is because they have community. So we don't know who our neighbors are. We don't know who the people in our communities are. We don't have any of those types of connections that really make us the type of world that I think we would all want to live in. And so we really have to go out of our ways to build real, true, meaningful communities. And that's at the very kind of micro level of who do you live next to, but goes all the way up to a macro when we talk about electoral politics for your district, for your school district, for you know, national politics. All of those things is we have to build communities that are based on humanity and understanding, and recognize that humans are humans first. And the reason why humans do things is for human reasons. And unless we're addressing those human reasons, we'll never be able to do anything.
Cid?
Yeah, and so I see this as a gradual process. I work a lot, you know, with following activists and getting their stories, but I also spend a lot of time talking to police officers in my work. I try to look at both perspectives. And I talked to some officers where I've done my research in Sacramento. They're already starting to change their police force. They have these response teams that are becoming specialized. They don't quite know what it's going to look like, but we're already starting to see gradual and small change in ways that are intended to de-escalate situations with residents. So I see this as a gradual, incremental, slow process. I don't see the police going away anytime soon. And I think each of these small incremental changes can lead to a different kind of public safety over time, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. And I don't think that it's going to happen in a kind of swift, radical fashion.
Okay. I'm going to ask a quick question, and then so if you limit, we're at 101. So if you, I'm sorry, but limit your answers to something short, that would be great for those who are.
I don't mind staying after.
Okay. Well, then I'll ask. Yeah, if you have to leave, then you can leave. But I'm talking to everybody on the Zoom. There's some people asking about what they can do as students, alumni, if they're interested in this. Now, I do know that everybody's going to get a thank you for attending note with links to resources that you have provided, both of you. So that will come. But there are people saying, what can those of us who are not Black or brown do to work for a just model of policing? That's a direct question. That was a submitted question.
I mean, so I have a couple of responses. So one, as you mentioned, I think there's going to be a link that's sent out to a number of different kind of organizations and resources. One, you need to inform yourself, read as much as you can. If you already kind of want to support these types of movements, well, then you have to talk to your people, talk to your family members, talk to your communities. If you're not just as mad about racism and about police brutality as I am, that's a problem. If your family is not just mad about racism and police brutality as you are, that's part of the problem. So we have to be able to address that. And people who have money should be donating that money to organizations that are doing the work. I mean, quite frankly, we live in a capitalist society, and it's very difficult to be free in a capitalist society if you don't have capital. So find organizations like Pillars of the Community, find organizations and people like Bishop Bowser and other community members who are doing things, and donate, support them. And so I think sometimes there's this idea that, oh, I want to go into the communities that are most impacted and work with them. Really, the issue that we have is mainstream racism. And unless we're dealing with that on a basis of, you know, white people talking to other white people and their family members, working in the communities isn't going to help anything. We got that. Our community has our community. We can handle that. What we need for help in is putting pressure on elected officials to stop shielding police from being able to abuse the power that they've been given.
Sid, last word, and then I'll
yeah. Well, I agree with Khalid, but I still think that the best way to learn about things is through direct experience and getting out of people's comfort zone So if there are opportunities where students, faculty, residents feel comfortable, going out and meeting and having some sort of contact, I think is the way to learn and to get beyond, reading is important, absolutely. That's a way of developing self-awareness, but it's going out in the community in some capacity. It doesn't have to be volunteering and maybe doing the heavy lifting in the community, but getting involved in the community in some capacity, I think, is a way of kind of gaining another kind of knowledge about the issue.
Okay. I have closing remarks, but I want to just add something of my own right now. This is what I love most about USD, in that we have controversial conversations, but we also always try to blend the academic with the community. And that's what I love about working here. So thank you both for doing this. So we are over our hour, and I want to thank our speakers, Cid and Khaled, for this fascinating presentation and discussion. And I also thanks to the entire audience for being here. I think you stuck, I can see the numbers at the bottom, you stuck it out the entire time. So as you just heard, you will receive a thank you email. I think it's coming tomorrow. It will have today's recording and the speaker's contact information and other resources, so look out for that. And follow the College of Arts and Sciences and the Humanities Center on social media. We've got Facebook, Instagram, Twitter accounts, and you can start with USD CAS as a way to connect with us. It'll be on the thank you note as well. But it was nice spending this Wednesday afternoon with you. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Khaled. Thanks, Noelle.